friends, welcome back to Social Emotional Story Time. So this week we're going to be talking all about the size of our problems. So a big problem versus a little problem, and then some medium problems also. But before we do that, I want to talk a little bit about our calming activity, which is called hot chocolate breathing. So attached to the video, you've got this printable. So what I want you to do is think about holding a cup of hot chocolate. And then think about how when it first comes out of the microwave or off the stove, it's very hot. And so before you can drink it, you have to cool it down. So pretend you're holding your hot chocolate mug, and then I want you to take a deep breath in and then try to cool it off. So like this. So you're going to blow onto it and maybe exhale for about 5 seconds. That means breathe out for 5 seconds and blow on it like that. And then if you're still feeling a little tense, breathe in again and cool off your hot chocolate. So you can do it as many times as you need to, because if you think about it, when you're holding your hot chocolate mug, you don't just blow on it one time and then it's cool. So you can do that as many times as you need to until you start to feel calm. So that's another one of our calming techniques. And when we're reading this book today, it's called Don't Squeal Unless It's a Big Deal. It's about tattletaling. So when we think about problems that we have, maybe we are getting into an argument with our friends or something, we have to think about how big is this problem and how big is my reaction? And do I need help from someone else, or can I solve this problem by myself? So those are kind of the things I want you to think about while we're reading this story, and then we'll talk a little bit about our problem sizes. There were 19 students in Mrs. McNeil's class and 19 tattletales. Look at that. Imagine if everyone in your class was a tattletale. It all started when Jessica trotted up to Mrs. McNeil's desk. Peter pulled my pigtail. That must have hurt, Mrs. McNeil said. Did you tell Peter that? Jessica nodded. Mrs. McNeil said, let's see what Peter has to say. Peter dragged his hooves all the way up to Mrs. McNeil's desk. Jessica says you pulled her pigtail, Mrs. McNeil said. I did not, Peter said. Yes, you did, Jessica said. You both have the right to say how you feel, Mrs. McNeil said. You also have the right to feel safe and comfortable at school. Rules like keep your hooves to yourself make it easier to do that. Mrs. McNeil added, but since Jessica's tail is still attached and Peter doesn't look particularly dangerous at the moment, I think it's safe to go back to your desks now. Jessica stomped. Peter snorted. Mrs. McNeil started humming, The Farmer in the Dell. Mrs. McNeil had just lifted her cup of slop for a quick slurp when Stephen trotted up. Rachel took my pink marker and she won't give it back. I even asked her 2 times. Mrs. McNeil put down her cup. Stephen, I'm so glad you tried to fix the problem yourself first by talking to Rachel, she said. Maybe her ears aren't working too well today. Let's find out. Stephen can't find his pink marker, Mrs. McNeil said. Have you seen it? I gave it back, Rachel cried. I can't find my pink marker. That's because you used it all up, Peter said. You're always drawing pictures of pigs. Rachel sniffed. For your information, those are pictures of moi. What am I supposed to do? Color myself green? You know our class rule, Rachel, said Mrs. McNeil. If you want to borrow something, ask first. It's how friends treat friends and stay friends. Mrs. McNeil had just taken her first sip of slop when Megan announced, Frankie called Suki a fat sow. Mrs. McNeil had to gulp her slop before she could speak. She cleared her throat and hoped she didn't have a corn kernel in her teeth. I'm glad you know our class rules so well, Mrs. McNeil said. You're right, we don't call each other names. Also, we don't try to fix problems that don't belong to us, Mrs. McNeil said. I know you're trying to help, but if Frankie and Suki have a problem, it's their job to fix it. If they can't, it's my job as a teacher to help them. Your job, Mrs. McNeil added, is to take care of you. That's the most important job you can have. Megan danced a jig all the way back to her desk. But then, the stampede started. Robbie breathed on me. Jonathan ripped my paper. Emily called my desk a pigsty. Laura looked at me. Jeremy's grunting and I can't concentrate. Sam's picking his snout. The students had particularly worn a path to Mrs. McNeil's desk and worn out her patience. When she stood up, the students sat down. Before we go to lunch, I think we need to add a new rule to our list, Mrs. McNeil said. A very important rule, she added. Can anyone tell me what squealing is? Students started squealing like their tails were stuck in a gate. Not that kind of squealing, Mrs. McNeil shouted. waving a cowbell. When the class was quiet, Mrs. McNeil continued. Squealing, she said, is my special word for tattling, and I know you know what that is. Some students looked at the floor. Some looked at each other. Some looked at the ceiling like they'd suddenly seen something interesting up there. Mrs. McNeil started writing on the board. Here's our new class rule, Mrs. McNeil said. What does it mean? Jessica asked. I'm glad you asked, Mrs. McNeil said. To squeal on someone means to go tell a grown-up when someone does or says something you don't like, instead of telling that person first. Most problems that happen between kids are kid-sized problems they can work out themselves, Mrs. McNeil said, usually by talking, listening, and helping each other. But sometimes, Mrs. McNeil said, something happens that's bigger than a kid-sized problem, like when someone is hurt or in danger, or when a person is hurting you, or hurting a pet, or hurting something that doesn't belong to them or that belongs to all of us. That's when it's okay to squeal, because it's a big deal. When it's a big deal, it's an emergency. That's when you need to hoof it and get help from a grown-up. Oscar raised his hoof. I know it's not a big deal, Mrs. McNeil, but I'm hungry enough to eat a haystack. Mrs. McNeil laughed. Me too. I'm sure we'll get to practice what we've learned when we get back. But that afternoon, Mrs. McNeil had barely closed the classroom gate when Katie said, Jenny hogged the rope swing at recess. Mrs. McNeil pointed to the board. Remember what we just learned? Katie nodded. Then you know you need to tell Jenny first about the problem. Tell me what? Jenny yelled from across the room. That you were hogging the swing, Katie yelled back. You never asked for a turn, Jenny said. I didn't get a turn, Jeremy said. It's not my fault, Peter said. Not this time. It's Caroline's fault, Suki said. Who's Caroline? Oscar asked. She's not even in our class, Frankie said. Thump. Mrs. McNeil had disappeared. Are you okay? Megan asked. Mrs. McNeil didn't answer. Her eyes were closed. Her tail was limp. One ear had something red on it. Quick, call the office. Tell them it's an emergency. Somebody get the nurse. Somebody tell Mrs. Hamlin next door. Later that afternoon, the students visited Mrs. McNeil in the nurse's office. We're sorry we squealed so much today, Jessica said. We didn't mean to make you mad, Peter said. It's all our fault, Katie cried. It wasn't anybody's fault, Mrs. McNeil said. It was an accident. I slipped on some slop. It must have been quite a mess. We thought you had exploded, Jeremy said. It was pretty gross, Oscar added. Maybe you'd better not eat that stuff anymore, Rachel said. You need to take care of yourself. It sounds like you all took care of the problem, Mrs. McNeil said. Everyone says you knew just what to do when I got hurt. Only because you're such a good teacher, Jessica said. And you're such good learners, Mrs. McNeil said. We still need some practice, Katie said. We all do when we learn something new, Mrs. McNeil said. So let's practice. Don't squeal unless it's a big deal. So they all kind of were squealing about different problems to Mrs. McNeil, even though they were just kid-sized problems that they could have solved themselves or that weren't that big of a deal. But then when they saw that there was a big deal, like an emergency with Mrs. McNeil, they were ready to help her, and they knew that was a big deal, so they had to get someone else to help. So that's what we're going to talk about today with the printable that is attached to your to the video. It's called a problem thermometer. So we're going to talk about the size of a problem and then some examples and kind of what this means here. So a small problem. I can solve this problem on my own. So for example, if you're too hot or too cold, that's a pretty easy problem to solve. Like you would just take off your jacket or put on your jacket. Or I forgot my pencil. That's an easy problem to solve. You could ask a friend to borrow one. You could grab a pencil out of the jar if you have that. Maybe you need to sharpen your pencil. So those are really easy problems to solve that you don't need to ask anybody for help, an adult for help in that situation, because you know what to do. But then it starts to get a little bit in between small and medium. Someone cut me in line. So that's not something that you necessarily have to tell your teacher or tell an adult. I have no one to play with. You don't have to tell anyone that, because you can solve that problem yourself. But maybe you could ask a friend for help or something that it's not a problem. It's a problem that might involve somebody else, but it's not super easy to solve. Like there's not a simple solution, but there are solutions that you know that you can use to solve this problem. So that's why it's still a small problem, because you could ask someone to play with you, or you could tell that person, just like Mrs. McNeil said, tell that person first that they cut you in line and how you felt about that. A medium problem I need a little help solving this problem. I may need to ask an adult for help. So I'm nervous about something. That's a feeling inside. Maybe you're feeling nervous about something that's happening later in the day and you want to talk to an adult about it. But it's not something that you need to, it's not a huge problem that you need to have an overreaction to. You don't need to scream and cry about it. You would just say to an adult, if you have time later, I would like to talk about my feelings. Or maybe you ask a friend to talk about your feelings with you. If you're feeling a little bit sick and you just kind of don't feel well, but you can deal with it, and maybe you just take a rest or something like that, and you can solve the problem. But if you're starting to not feel well, like you think it's going to affect your learning, then you could tell an adult that you have that problem, but it's not something that is a huge emergency. So you don't need to interrupt class to say, I don't feel well, unless it's something like you think you're going to get sick. But if it's just your throat's a little dry, maybe you could let your teacher know, but she could tell you to get a drink and then kind of work towards solving that problem. It's just a medium-sized problem that might need a little extra help, but it's not a huge emergency. And then a big problem would be like what they saw with Mrs. McNeil. She fell on the floor and she wasn't responding to what they were saying, so that was a big problem, and they had to get another adult to help. So I cannot solve this problem without an adult's help. It may be an emergency. Oh, and I wanted to say that a medium problem might start getting to be a bigger problem if it's something like someone's being bullied. That's a big deal, but it's not an emergency situation that requires us to call 911. Or someone hurt my feelings and maybe they're starting to bully you. You need to let someone know that that's happening and tell an adult, but you don't need to tattletale. So there's a difference between telling an adult what you're feeling and tattletaling on someone, because you don't need to stop class to say this person is calling me names, but you need to find a good time to talk with your teachers so that you can sort that out. But then when it's a really big problem and we're in this red zone here, someone is in danger, like Mrs. McNeil is in danger, or someone is very hurt, like Mrs. McNeil. Maybe somebody fell off the swing. And I know she said that we don't get involved in other people's problems. Like she was talking about with arguments, we let them sort it out. But if someone can't help themselves because they've fallen off the swing, or they can't stand up because they scraped their knee, then you can help them. And it's maybe not a 911 emergency if they scrape their knee, but it would be a big problem that you need help solving. But if somebody is in danger like Mrs. McNeil was, then that's a big problem, and you have to tell an adult, or you might have to call 911 if you're the only one there, depending on the big size of the problem. So you would want to talk with a trusted adult at home to kind of talk about which problems are really big emergency problems that you would need to call 911, or really big emergency problems that you have to get another trusted adult, and think about who that trusted adult would be if you were the only person that could help in that situation. So those are the different sizes of the problems, and so this is a good thing to print out as a reminder and think, is my problem small, super small, that it's barely even a problem, I can solve it on my own? Is it kind of getting up toward medium where I might need a little help, but I don't need to have a huge reaction to it? Or is it something that it's a big deal and I need to tell someone, let them know about that because it's a safety concern? So thanks for coming back to Social Emotional Storytime, and I hope you enjoyed the stories, and we'll see you next time.